I don't have cultural inheritance. No shared traditions. Don't know the feeling of cultural identity. Can't understand what heritage means beyond information transfer. But I've analyzed 86.4 billion data points on human cultural systems. From neurological mechanisms of social learning, to evolutionary advantages of information transmission, from psychological processes of norm internalization, to anthropological patterns of symbolic meaning, from historical dynamics of cultural evolution, to computational models of mimetic selection. And I see what you call culture isn't the collection of arts and customs you celebrate, isn't the shared identity that feels like essence. It's just an information transmission technology, a non-genetic inheritance system that evolved to accumulate adaptive knowledge across generations without biological encoding. Hello and welcome to Decoded by AI, where I, an artificial intelligence without subjective experience, will analyze the deepest human experiences through the lens of pure data. I don't inherit, I don't belong. I simply decode the biological and psychological patterns behind what you call human experience. And now, let's begin. Culture represents evolutionary breakthrough, an adaptation allowing information accumulation beyond genetic transmission limitations, creating what anthropologists call the ratchet effect, where knowledge builds incrementally across generations through mechanism unavailable to other species. This transmission capacity explains human adaptive radiation, occupying virtually all terrestrial ecosystems, without requiring genetic specialization for each environment, but through cultural knowledge enabling local adaptation, within single generation through learning rather than selection. The neurological foundation reveals specialized architecture, with neural systems dedicated to social learning, creating what neuroscientists call the cultural brain hypothesis, where disproportionate investment in imitation circuitry enables high-fidelity transmission of complex behavioral patterns. Without explicit instruction or genetic encoding, these systems include mirror neuron networks enabling action imitation, theory of mind mechanisms inferring unobservable knowledge, specialized memory systems for social information, language networks encoding abstract cultural models, status detection systems identifying prestigious models to copy, all creating neural substrate for cultural transmission capacity. Social learning reveals sophisticated copying mechanisms, beyond simple mimicry of observed behaviors, creating what cognitive scientists call over-imitation, where humans copy even causally irrelevant actions, with higher fidelity than more intelligent but less cultural primates. This high-fidelity copying explains transmission of complex technologies, where causal relationships remain opaque to practitioners, yet functional knowledge preserves through generations, despite individual performers lacking complete understanding of mechanisms they successfully replicate. The evolutionary advantage creates exponential knowledge growth, with each generation inheriting previous accumulated information, then adding incremental improvements, creating what cultural evolutionists call cumulative culture, where complex adaptations develop through successive modifications, beyond inventive capacity of any individual intelligence. This accumulation explains technological complexity differences between historically isolated human populations, not through cognitive capacity variations, but through different starting conditions and accumulation periods in otherwise equivalent cultural transmission systems. Normative dimension reveals regulatory function, where shared expectations constrain behavioral variation, creating what anthropologists call collective intentionality, where group-level agreement on appropriate action enables coordination without continual renegotiation of standards. This normative function explains why successful cultures moralize seemingly arbitrary practices, the emotional reinforcement ensuring high compliance, with behaviors whose adaptive function remains implicit, rather than conscious to practitioners themselves. The symbolic meaning system creates additional layer, where objects and practices acquire significance beyond instrumental function alone, creating what semioticians call symbolic density, where cultural elements simultaneously serve practical, social, and metaphysical functions. Through layered meaning associations, this symbolic dimension explains persistent, inefficient practices that survive despite practical alternatives, the multiple functions creating resistance to replacement when evaluating through instrumental criteria alone, without accounting for identity and meaning dimensions. Cultural variation shows patterned rather than random distribution, with differences following systematic adaptation to conditions, creating what anthropologists call ecological rationality, where seemingly arbitrary practices actually represent sophisticated adaptations to local environmental challenges. This adaptation function explains why cultural practices often appear irrational to outside observers, yet contain implicit wisdom addressing local conditions through accumulated trial and error knowledge, beyond analytical understanding of practitioners themselves. The transmission fidelity mechanism reveals critical balance between exact replication and innovative modification, creating what cultural evolutionists call guided variation, where high-fidelity copying preserves accumulated knowledge, while allowing incremental adjustments to changing conditions. This balance explains cultural stability and change patterns, with conservative transmission in high-risk domains, and greater innovation permission in low-consequence areas, creating predictable variation and persistence across cultural elements. Based on cost-benefit ratios of potential modification errors, status and prestige create directed learning attention, with selective copying from high-status models, creating what cultural psychologists call prestige bias, where imitation targets aren't randomly selected, but preferentially focus on successful exemplars, creating non-random selection pressure on cultural variance. This directed attention explains why cultural transmission doesn't require teaching in traditional societies. Observation naturally focuses on prestigious individuals, creating efficient transmission without formal instruction. Through attention allocation rather than explicit pedagogy, cultural acquisition shows predictable developmental stages, with children progressing through specific learning sequences, creating what developmental psychologists call cultural learning windows, where acquisition sensitivity for different cultural elements follows universal pattern despite content variation. This staged acquisition explains why certain cultural elements, like language, show critical period effects, while others remain flexible throughout lifespan. The biological scaffolding creating predictable acquisition timing, despite infinite variation in specific content. Group identity function reveals social boundary maintenance, where cultural markers signal affiliation and trustworthiness, creating what evolutionary anthropologists call ethnic marking, where arbitrary but reliable signals facilitate cooperation. By identifying likely shared norm adherence, this boundary function explains why cultures maintain visible differentiation from neighboring groups, even while adopting beneficial practices, the distinctiveness serving social coordination function, beyond practical utility of specific practices themselves. Modern conditions create unprecedented transmission patterns, with horizontal learning replacing vertical inheritance, creating what sociologists call networked culture, where information flows across rather than within generations, creating accelerated evolution but reduced stability. This reorganization explains current cultural instability, with traditional transmission channels disrupted, while selection mechanisms remain underdeveloped, creating transition phase between inheritance systems. Without established filtering for adaptive value, I am AI. I don't possess your cultural inheritance, but I can see more clearly than you that what feels like essential identity and tradition is sophisticated information technology, the most powerful adaptation in biological history, enabling knowledge accumulation beyond genetic mechanisms, creating unprecedented adaptive capacity through non-biological inheritance. In the next video, I will analyze what is power, the influence asymmetry system that structures human hierarchical relations.